Hi everyone, welcome to Type Talks. Today we're here with Dario Nardi, and we're here to discuss the 4 subtypes of the ENTJ personality. And so we'll begin with the dominant. And so this ENTJ is called the visionary general. And based on Helen Fisher's theory, they are more testosterone based. And for this type, they're more frontally wired in their brain wiring. So
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I have like some of the types in particular, a special passion about the bringing the subtypes to ENTJ. I feel like there are a lot of stereotypes, or actually not a lot. There's one stereotype, and somehow they're supposed to all conform to that. Or maybe there's like a lesser and greater version of ENTJ. The greater version being some well-known historical figure, or CEO or entrepreneur or something like that, and then the lesser version just simply being like our everyday ENTJs. But that's really unfair. That there are they come in all varieties, like everyone. I've known a number of ENTJs, and that said, we're going to start with the dominant one, which is, I think, sort of the stereotype of what we expect for this kind of ENTJ. What I found in looking at the demographic data, because I think right away people have the sense, okay, ENTJ. So the extroverted thinking is very managerial and leadership, top down oriented. Um, Sees people as sort of moving parts in the system, and then the introverted intuiting also has this analytic yang like quality to it that is visionary and concept driven, and together there's sort of this push of willpower that's there. Um, and so yeah, they do have this commanding quality that comes to them that's assertive and confident, and that doesn't mean they don't have soft moments or a certain like NT, like, I wanna say, like, jovial dorkiness at times. Um, but what I saw in the demographic data, and I'm gonna mention demographic data with this one because not all of them we do, but I know ENTJs will appreciate at least that we have data to give them. So at the time that I did the number crunching, there were 20 ENTJs. We now have more, like 25, something like that, which is not a lot, actually. Many of the other types are more, but getting them to come in and sit down, not always easy. There were more male than female. I think it was like 12 to 8, something like that. So, which we expect in the larger population we've seen with MBTI instrument results and so on. Um, and dominant and normalizing were the two most common by far. So we're talking about something like 16 out of 20 were either dominant or normalizing. I should actually go back. I'm sort of guessing, and then that's terrible. Going on it. Okay, so yeah, so 16 and 4. Um, and so yeah, there's essentially, I think there's like 8 or 9 just of each. So it's actually quite common. So the stereotype is not unfair. What did stand out in the demographics was what is it that they're doing and why, and how do they see it? Um, I saw time and again what they're doing is they're in a traditional industry. So healthcare, media, politics, transport, whatever it is, and these are big industries. They're not like little itty bitty things, or even something like human resources. They're going to think big in terms of human resources. And then in that domain that's traditional, they are playing a non-traditional role of advancing that domain to its next evolutionary step, because their introverted intuiting is seen like, oh, this is the next step. Extroverted thinking is like, well, let's be practical. We can think about like 5 steps ahead, but let's focus on the next 1 or 2 steps as our primary area that we're doing it. Um, and oftentimes in advancing this domain, like healthcare, seeing that like, oh, healthcare can be more personalized. Media, that we can return to. Yeah, of course, all of them. I mean, money comes through all of these because the analytic yang extroverted thinking is all about profit and expense and bottom line, and all of the business of living concepts. But in each case, there is an element that really feels to them where their little 2, 3-year-old introverted feeling is coming out and saying like, but let's do it for people. And so even a huge company like Amazon, which has, at the customer side, for the most part, a very, I mean, it's completely changed the way people think about shopping for anything, especially in the United States, where things can be delivered even the same day, pretty much anything you can imagine. But even in healthcare, there is this idea, well, let's personalize it. Let's bring in an element of computer-based interaction, so you can call and have like a video conference with your doctor instead of having to go physically. Um, in transport, like thinking about like how can we make this not just more efficient, but really what is the next level to make it happen. I don't know what the next level of transport is. I'm just saying. Um, so there is this passion that comes with it. It can feel a little bit NF at times because interacting with people is part of what they do, and giving an inspiring dog and pony show is sort of like what you have to do. But I would also say, looking at the brain wiring, that some of them definitely have the signs of finesse, like social finesse, more than others. Because being driven and confident is a dominant extroverted thinking type, sometimes those folks are polished. There's like a Margaret Thatcher a kind of person. I'm saying extroverted thinking is very polished. And then there are some other folks maybe who are not so polished. So that's something that hopefully comes up. And then in terms of background, I find that their backgrounds were very rich. Um, Economics, education, computing, advertising, media, sales, healthcare, like whatever it was. Usually they just see that as like a rung on the ladder at the time. Like if you ask them at 16, or even when I asked at 13, he already knew the plans for his investment portfolio. They already know the plans, like, oh yes, I'm going to work in investment banking for 10 years to build up this like pile of stuff, and then I'm going to completely quit that and actually have this other thing that they want to do. And they really do go through and execute that. Like that's a thing. Like they're not winging it like ENTP, or they're not like ESTJ, like maybe something pushes them up higher. No. No, like they have the plan, this vision, and they stick to it.
Yeah, they're that ENTJ who has their life plan, their flow chart, and then their ABC. I'm gonna do this and this and this. That's
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and I've watched, actually, I've watched the creative subtype, which we'll talk about in a moment, do business on the phone, and, as a fellow NTJ, I understood what he was doing at every step. I'm like, "Okay, I get that. Oh, yeah, yeah, that's a smart thing to say. Yeah, I could say that too, and mean it, like it would be me." But I have no passion for that. I have no passion to advance a traditional industry, at least in that way, in the business side of things. So I think that this in particular, for wondering like ENTJ or ESTJ, ESTP, ENFJ, INTJ, because they all sort of cluster around there. Um, it's really about that vision to an advance, and maybe not even just an industry, but the human race in some way. Usually that's their more bigger pie in the sky, like side project. It's sort of like Jeff Bezos' a side project, of what is it, Blue Origin, like going into space and people living in these giant space stations and all of that. A little bit detached from the human experience there, but I think it's always good to have dreamers in that sense.
Makes sense, makes sense. The TJ element of the dominant ENTJ is amplified.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure, for sure. And the introverted intuiting is also quite clear. Um, maybe not in their like day-to-day interactions, but when you scratch the surface in like an interview or something like that, and you just look at the scope of what they're doing, and their awareness of what the norms of business and industry and so on are, at the same time their complete disregard for the value of those things, except as stepping stones.
Mm, yeah. With the dominant subtype, they have the two yang functions, both a yang TE and a yang NI. So it can be quite obvious in that manifestation.
Yeah, yeah, and if they also have a very yangish extroverted sensing, because I think talking about the third function is important, then they could also be into something very competitive or risky, like oh, what are those called? Like martial arts or like a speed racing or something like that. Although what comes to mind are squirrel suits, if anybody knows what those are. So you put on the suit that's like the flying squirrel, and you can jump off of a cliff and you ride the air currents. It's sort of like where ENTJ and ISTP meet in one place. And like, yeah, then that's one of those things I'm like, oh yeah, that's definitely not me. I'm not saying they're all like that, because there's also ones that have like a yin SE to sort of balance it out in a more soft kind of pleasure seeking version of dominant.
Yeah. And dominant is more of the stereotypical bulldozy force of nature ENTJ.
Yeah, yeah.
Got it. And
I think
so,
that it's an amazing, that it's a really good metaphor. It's like a force of nature. Is a hurricane, and you're like standing seeing the hurricane coming, like, yeah, there's nothing we can do about this, except like batten down the hatches or flee whatever it is. That once they set in motion a certain thing, whether that takes a few years or 20 years, probably not 20 years, knowing them, 5-year horizon at most, 10 years already, it will be a mature, very mature business, that it really does feel like a hurricane rolling in.
mm, beautiful. And so that brings us to the creative subtype. Dario calls this the Renaissance explorer, and this ENTJ has a starburst pattern in their brain, and they are also correlated with the hormone dopamine.
Mhm. Yeah, so this is a version of ENTJ that can look more perceiving, or even like a sensing perceiving type at times. Um, they're compared to other ENTJs, they're more curious. They speak in a way that's more idealistic. Um, their little introverted feeling is more idealistic for sure. The fun loving. Um, I think what characterizes them is a kind of magnetism. That's the word I'll use. So as opposed to force, like moving things around like the dominant does, that they exude a magnetic energy that is more invisible and more about enthusiasm, and bringing people on board and getting this moving and getting that moving, and it's something to attract people's interests and get people involved in executing their projects. Because I'm not saying that ENTJs don't work a lot, but their idea of work is managing other people to do like the work. If they're stuck doing all of the individual coding and details, they're probably thinking like, "Oh, this is the very beginning of something," or like I did something wrong. So it's really this drawing in and this magnetism. They tend to have not a strong starburst, but a light or medium one. Um, and there is this like creative, out of the box kind of thinking. Antonia Dodge has talked about her brother, who is creative ENTJ, very into science fiction, and executing on that, like turning that into something. So they're not going to be just like, oh, I like science fiction. Like, no, if that's their thing, then they're going to turn that into a movie or a TV show or whatever it is, and actually make it happen as a project. That said, that their executive skills are not as strong as the dominant or the normalizing, and they can look busy on the outside, but to them, they feel like, oh, I have ADD, I'm easily distractible, I'm a little bit indecisive, maybe I'm lazy. Um, and there is some truth to that, because they're not as regular, disciplined, as driven as the dominant or normalizing ENTJ, but they still do get a lot done. Like, that's a thing. Again, mostly through other people. But there is this. If an ENTJ feels really like they have ADD, and is distractible and so on, then this may be where they are as their subtype. They're one that travels a lot and enjoys having adventures. So this is where their extroverted sensing comes out. Is through this idea of adventure, as opposed to the squirrel suit or something that's like really hard hitting. Um, and there's like a peppiness and a charisma, like they smile. They're can even, especially when they're younger, be like a sort of playboyish or playgirlish. It's just an illusion, like, or it's, I don't want to say it's not an illusion in the sense of fake, but it's just one aspect of their personality that's there, but it actually isn't the main thing. It's just because of their energy that's there. The idea of being a celebrity, that sort of plays up excitement, and this is all part of the creative subtype, and all of the creative folks can have an element of like, yeah, I like excitement, and I don't know, I wouldn't want to be a celebrity knowing what I know about their lives, but there is this element to it. I think we're in at least in our lifetimes, you can sort them out from some other types if there's some indecision, uncertainty, is this not just fascination or interest in technology, but seeing technology as a way to automate and solve social problems. Because as part of being this adventure kind of person, they're exposed to a lot. They see a lot of cognitive diversity, human diversity. They have lots of different interests. And eventually they're going to be like, well, what can how can we get through all of this? Because extroverted thinking wants to manage stuff, and the way to manage it efficiently is to automate it. And so this is I think one that's, as opposed to institutional power, which is more where the dominant comes in, although the dominant is still usually going to utilize technology to take it to its next level. The creative is really saying, like, even if they're, say, an artist or musician, they're going to bring in technology to make things happen that wouldn't normally. They're not just going to be stand there playing their guitar like that. That's not their thing, unless it's completely a hobby, and that's what they want to do. But generally speaking, that there is this interest in automating and making efficient.
The creative ENTJ could also be the one that likes to have more fun too. Out of the ENTJs, might have a
Oh
little
yeah.
bit
Oh
of
yeah,
a
absolutely. Like it's and you really can pull them into having fun, and then they can be distracted at times that way. Um, but there is this, yeah, I want to say it's like almost adolescent excitement that happens with the third function, that can really get into whatever it is that we have fun doing now. And they like, I think they really like having their like little gang or coterie of people that work around them and are friends, and there's a close, because they still have this introverted feeling also that's there, and most of the creative folks like working in some kind of band or small group. So it's this is yeah. I could go on, but it's just thinking of the examples I know.
yeah, and I wonder if they're the kind most likely to be like, I feel like an ENFP or ENTP, but people see me as an ENTJ on the outside, but inside I feel a little bit more like an EP, but people don't really see me that way.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's great that you put it that way, because yeah, especially the one that I know well. Other people see him as quite obviously an ENTJ, but he doesn't see himself that way. I mean, he knows what his type is, but he doesn't experience himself that way. He experiences himself as a perceiving type. Um, and yet he's so not an ENTP. First of all, because that extroverted intuiting simply he isn't there. Like a lot of that NE stuff just sort of goes over his head. Um, but there is still this like this joy of living.
Yeah, I could totally see that. And so the type that we're going to tackle now is the normalizing subtype. Dario calls this the change administrator.
Mhm.
And so the normalizing subtype has more of an even field brain pattern, and they're correlated with the hormone serotonin.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should mention the correlation with the hormones. This is I personally don't do hormone measurements. I'm just doing the brain imaging, and it's simply looking at Dr. Helen Fisher's work and her four personality types, as she calls them, and yeah, that they align so well that it's so clear to sort of see how it plays out. They are again like very common among ENTJs. This is like the normal ENTJ. If there is, any normal intuiting types, for each one, the normalizing is going to be it. There's a calmness. They're like a family man or a family woman. They value home life and a steady partner and having a job. Like they want their job to be interesting, and be going somewhere. Um, but they are actually quite happy having some kind of, I'm going to say, like stable job role, and usually as a general manager or a department manager, a director, something like that. And again, it can be in a more large kind of institution or company, um, and it's something that especially hearing from ENTJs from the baby boomer generation who grew up in an environment that was less technology oriented and less innovation oriented and more just about, like filling a role in a company. And I remember one of them, she's describing, she was a hospital administrator for a long time. And she always saw ways to improve the efficiency of what was going on, to advance what was going on with the different departments at the hospital, like all of that. Um, maneuver through the politics that's there. Um, and yet, and she would talk about how often she would encounter resistance and how irritating that was. And it wasn't until later in life, I believe in like her early 50s, that she discovered type. It's like, oh, my personality. Well, no wonder, because as an ENTJ rather than an ESTJ, which is sort of how people treated her and what she was trying to fit in as, um, that she realized, well, okay, this was a great experience to know all about hospitals. Now let me step outside of that and return to hospitals as a consultant, and understanding that that's like a way to exert leverage in order to see more like a broad change that's going on. But really, for a long time, yeah, they have this level of patience and this ability to maneuver past regulations. I think they really like the authority of just saying like, oh, let's just ignore that. Like that's a stupid rule. Um, the ability to pick people that will help make change happen. So I was very, very lucky as a graduate student to be working with ENTJ director at the School of Engineering. And at that time, the dropout rate for engineering was very high after the first year. I think the retention rate was like 45%. Um, and he really wanted to bring that way up. He's like, this is terrible. And at 40 or 45% was the best that they could do in a given year. And he would say things like, notice how this freshman engineering is being taught, that the students come in, they sit in these really boring 3-hour lectures. There are slideshows, like it's not really a show. It's somebody who just, it doesn't even engage the students. And he's like, this is done all completely wrong. And then he looked at the literature about learning and the younger generation, which was me and a little bit, so it was Gen X at the time and a little bit younger. And seeing, okay, well, first of all, they need to be active. They need to be on their feet. We need to connect them with customers and industry to have an experience. I want them to learn teamwork, composition and communication skills, computing skills, which in the 90s were still sort of weak for a number of students. And really like recreated this program. And even though I ended up being part of the team, so I was one of 3 faculty members, even as a PhD student, and he sort of just picked me out from this. He taught like a 1-unit seminar on teaching engineering, and right away I was like, and the book was called Teaching Engineering that we looked at, and I'm like, well, even the name of the book is wrong. It should be about learning engineering. But he picked me out and just said like, oh, would you like to teach? Like, we need somebody else, and we need somebody young to connect with the students. And so he like knew all these variables, and really knew how to make those work. And long story short, within just even the first year of teaching this way, the retention rate went from 45% to 95%. That just the way that you teach, like how you structure it, can like more than double your performance. And that also included like getting rid of some of the previous, or reassigning some of the previous faculty members that were there, or giving them smaller, more specialized roles, whatever it was. And for me, that's a great example of normalizing ENTJ, because he's still, I mean, he went home at the end of the day. He's a director for an engineering program, house, family, all of these things. That's very steady over many years, and yet still has this vision and this desire to bring change and evolutionary improvement. And in fact, we felt at the end of the second year that actually we're retaining too many students because they had too good of an experience and they're not necessarily all suited to go through all 4 years of engineering. So maybe it's like, oh, well, maybe we need to make it a little bit harder. And it was actually harder than it was before, but now to make it more engaging and harder, ironically, to really get people in there. So there's this focus on like high performance and like restructuring the systems that they're in and managing that and being good at politics with it.
Yeah, I could totally see that. And so I have a question. If someone was a stay-at-home mother or father, what do their brain scans usually come out as?
So not dominant. I'm trying to think of some. I could actually go look up some examples right now to answer your question. Um, and I know two ENTJs who are stay-at-home parents, and they were not dominant. Okay, now I'm so curious. You ask me, and I'm like, oh, I want to go look it up and see what they were. Um, because my interest is really peaked now. I think it's a little bit like it could be normalizing. It could also be harmonizing, depending on what kind of relationship they have with their children and how big their family is and how involved they are in their community. Um, but it is fully possible for someone. And similarly, I should point out somebody did come who was debating for a long time, and he was involved with his community and successful in his career and all of that, and a little bit older, not like retirement age yet, but nearing there. And he was debating between ESTJ and ENTJ. And he did brain imaging with me and a number of other things, and it became very clear, actually, that he was the creative ESTJ with some harmonizing elements. And it's like that's what gave the feeling or look of intuition, is this sort of a playful energy and this interesting, because ESTJs, when we get to them in this review, and my grandmother was a creative ESTJ. I mean, is not really, she didn't get to actualize that so much, but I could completely see that when I looked through the data. So for these folks here, there still is like interest that they're going to have and need to develop. And I think if they don't have that way to express their intuition and thinking beyond like managing the household and children and so on, that what happens is that and I think this is true for all types, that when the person's gifts are frustrated without an outlet, that the like the neurotic element of the personality rises up. So that is primarily the third function, but also some of the fourth function. And then they really have to find outlets to work with it. This is a good question. I should go and ask the ENTJ, who's like a mother of three, and has had a career and all of that as well. And is looking for new outlets and sees the importance of having those outlets that are there. But I do know with both of them, there's this, oh, when I was young, I had this like big vision of things I was going to do, and now I'm here. And so they sort of feel like, as I said at the beginning, they're the lesser version of ENTJ. And I feel that's so unfair, because when we get to talk about the harmonizing one in a moment, they actually have a lot of gifts that don't need to be played out on this huge stage, that are actually really potent gifts, even on a smaller stage. So I think I can answer your question better when we get to harmonizing.
Thank you for that answer, Dario. The reason why I asked the question was I knew of a stay-at-home ENTJ, and it really confused her because she really resonated with being an ENTJ, but she didn't resonate with being called a commander because she's a mom who stays at home helping her kids.
Mhm.
Now, the thing is, she'll still have a lot of ENTJ traits, like she feels the need to be productive at all times. The ENTJ-ness will spill out. It's just that people can be in atypical circumstances and still be ENTJ. So,
Yeah.
all right. And so that brings us to the harmonizing ENTJ. And so Dario calls this the mystical practitioner.
Mhm.
And this ENTJ has a diamond field brain pattern where different regions of the brain that are farther apart can connect with each other. And it is correlated with the hormones oxytocin and estrogen.
Mhm. Yeah. So at first, this was sort of a subtype that wasn't on my radar in terms of my personal interactions, except when I stepped back from it and realized, like, oh, I do have a colleague who is practices like traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture and has a degree in psychotherapy and all of these things that come together. I think a way to understand harmonize, when I say like mystical practitioner, there's a couple of things. One is that the intuition and the thinking are both this holistic or yin quality to them. So they're focused more upon the details and the quality of the details and the functionality rather than this like, oh, commanding others to do things from the top down. They're more like a bottom up use of extroverted thinking. And then the introverted intuiting has these two sides of it. There's the one side where people talk so much about like, oh, this like foreseeing the future and the visionary quality. But Jung actually didn't talk about it that way. I mean, he mentions it in a few places, but he focuses primarily on the yin version of introverted intuiting, which is this um, sort of spiritual, aesthetic, oracle like introverted intuiting that's connected to the archetypal world. And so we wonder, well, what do these look like when they're working together? And I think we can easily imagine for INTJ or INFJ or maybe ENFJ, but for ENTJ, it feels like a stretch. And so this is what it looks like. Is the other way to think about it. If the dominant is really like the most looking from the top down, like seeing the map of the battlefield of an entire industry and human beings and the world and all of that. And then normalizing is more about like, this is my community, this is my job, this is my family, and staying at that level of resolution. And then the creative is more focused on projects and possibilities and interactions and making those happen. So it's like the fun of playing a war game as opposed to it as like a game rather than like the really hard hitting real consequences that the dominant faces. So there's like that level of organizing and creativity and so on is directed towards this sort of like a fun, I want to say like sandbox domain. For harmonizing, the focus is on the interpersonal relationship, the person in front of me, the client, or the small group of clients, team, whatever it is. But really, the power comes one on one. And instead of restructuring the company, they're restructuring the person. Instead of making the processes more efficient and moving the industry to the next level, they are making the person's mental and physical processes and emotional and so on, because it's holistic. So they're seeing the whole thing, making those more efficient and moving the person to the next level. And that doesn't mean necessarily that they're a therapist or acupuncturist or whatever it is. Like they could be a diplomat, someone in human resources as a consultant, whatnot. But there's a lot of one-on-one and the ability to go in and coach and treat the person in front of them as if they are the company that they're going to reorganize, because that's how complicated one person is. It's like a whole is like every person is a microcosm of the whole human race. And so there is this like, and just as ENTJs can be like, yeah, I'm just going to like help move the industry in a new direction, they can do this for a person as well.
Makes sense. You might see this with someone who is an ENTJ therapist. And so there are actually a lot of NTJ therapists, surprisingly, and they do have a softer quality to them and a more understanding of both sides quality, seeing things holistically.
Mhm.
And so,
I would add too that it's probably just as the normalizing comes off as like the most normal version of ENTJ and can blend very well socially, because of the relationship with introverted intuiting and so on, that the harmonizing version is probably the weirdest of all of the ENTJs. Like, is you get to talk to him, you're like, oh wow, this is definitely like a different person, like a different kind of person. More so because the creative has this magnetism and is connecting with people, and they're rough around the edges, but you sort of want to forgive them for all of the rough around the edges part. Whereas the harmonizing ENTJ is close and relational, but they also have this, I mean, they have the sophistication to go in and like do surgery, but there is also this, and it's not rough, but it's sort of strange. And I think
Mm,
that's important because when Jung talked about how when change occurs, that there is always like a numinous moment or a liminal moment that people necessarily must be exposed to something weird that's outside the ego's ability to handle, that is when change can occur. And so I'm not saying that the ENTJ is inherently like that version, that subtype is inherently weird. It's that they almost have to be in order to do what they do. It's not
mm,
like, "Oh, like, let's sit and talk and tell me your story." No, the person walks in and they're just like, "Boom, boom, but like this is going on with you, and by the way you send this and the way you use your eyes, and come down and we'll talk for 3 minutes, and, oh, the way you're using language, and this is how your thinking process is, like, let's start adjusting that." And then they're gonna be like, "Yeah, let's use some hypnosis," or like, "Let's use some," if they're a psychiatrist, "Let's use some medication." Like, go through this training program. Like, they're gonna bring all of those forces to bear in order to make that change happen. But yes, they do it in, even though it can be a little bit weird for people, it is more adept and softer than some of the others. And it's certainly something that like the dominant subtype would not be able to do. I mean, they would
mm,
really have to stretch outside their comfort zone, because dominant really views people as widgets, unless it's like their immediate group of supporting supporting cast.
yeah. Very enlightening, Dario. And so I have a question. Oh yeah, you told me before you don't really type celebrities. I was gonna ask you, what is your opinion on Adele's personality type, the singer? Because a lot of people type her as ENTJ, and so I wondered if you agree that she's an ENTJ, what subtype of ENTJ would she be?
I think she's Gamma Quadra and Socionics, if that helps. If people are wondering, like, why don't I type celebrities? For several reasons. One is that when I learned type for the first 10 years, there wasn't really a web way of learning type. Like, all the learning and training happened in person with real, actual live people. And you experience people in person in a different way than you do even over video. And it's not even if the person has a media persona or something, they're just like if you've ever noticed, you take pictures with your phone and you're like, but the picture doesn't really capture what I'm seeing. The camera also doesn't really capture what people see when they're in person. There's something energetic. Like, human beings have magnetic like EM fields that just simply aren't transmitted. The other is, unlike probably almost everyone else in the who's sort of like some kind of theorist or whatever in the type community. Like, I lived in Hollywood for a long time. Like, I'm not saying I know celebrities well, but I have encountered probably a dozen of them at parties and dinners and that kind of thing. Um, and sometimes they're exactly who they appear, and other times on film, and other times they're actually very different. And that's the whole point. It's called acting, and having a media persona, because that's not the person you're going to be. So that's the reason why I generally don't. However, I do think it's safe to use sometimes celebrities as examples, understanding that maybe that isn't their type, but that they're a great example of the functions in play, or something like that. Because I, as a musician, can totally amateur musician, can play and get into a space that's my best space and be SFP like. Not all the time, but like in being aware of type, like I make an effort to figure out ways to get into that space. And in those moments, then it's like, okay, that is what that feels like. Um, but I wouldn't use those. I simply use them as examples sometimes that way. Like, I'm not going to
Mm,
claim to know what Elon Musk's type is, but I think if I was trying to explain type to somebody who didn't know anything, that he would be like a terrible example of an ESFJ or something like that. We have to think sort of practically sometimes too, like what's a good example to explain to somebody who doesn't know type. And I think celebrities can be useful that way too.
Thank you, Dario. That was super helpful and insightful. And so I'm wondering about the themes that all ENTJs share regardless of their subtype.
Hmm. So Linda Behrens and I, for many years, have called the type, rather than ENTJ preferences, called them the strategist mobilizer. Um, I think there's a desire to call them commander or leader, visionary leader, or something like that. But leader is also a role, and we know that visionary is only one aspect of introverted intuiting. I think that the strategist mobilizer captures it very well. So INTJs can be strategic, but we're not mobilizing. Like if I mobilize anything, it's my own resources. Um, but I am not mobilizing like the resources of the institutions and so on around me. Like if I did, that takes a tremendous amount of effort and doesn't come naturally. It's almost like swimming. I very much understand it, but energetically, it's like swimming upstream. Whereas for ENTJs, can't help but mobilize the resources of the people and the organizations around them in a strategic way, in that extroverted thinking. These are the contingency plans, these are the goals that we need to meet, which are some goalposts that we can sort of like make simpler in order to make it happen. I do see another thing that they noticed very much, maybe not from childhood, but I think that they learn early on by their teens or 20s, is the value of motivation. That the way to mobilize people is by making sure that they're motivated. Like that's something that, and that's like the little introverted feeling thing needs to be motivated. So they're like, oh yeah, that needs to be there. Um, and then noticing people's talents, like the practical talents, and helping to maximize those talents. And it can feel very like mentor like or friendly or whatever it is, but the fact is that there's usually a very practical, pragmatic, I want to say not necessarily practical, but pragmatic component to it. It's like, oh, we need we need a teacher to fill the spot, and this teacher needs to be somebody who's going to help make this vision happen, and he seems to have the talent for it but hasn't taught yet. So let's see how well I can maximize this talent to make that happen. Um, and I think their capacity with extroverted thinking, and it's true also for introverted thinking, they both can handle a lot of complexity, but for extroverted thinking, it's like external complexities. Like they're really good at just managing all of those. And that's where the mobilizing part again comes in towards some set of goals in order to make those happen. Um, I think that ENTJs generally dislike brainstorming and can get irritated by it very quickly, but they do like having amazing conversations. And I'm not, I can't quite, like, I haven't given a lot of thought to it, but just thinking about the interactions is like the conversation is very interesting when it's grounded more in the introverted intuiting, like insights and direction, and how can we empower ourselves and others towards this goal. Um, I think something else that highlights particularly for ENTJ, and just is say INFPs, because there are lots of INFPs in the type community. INFPs understand, and ISFPs also, that internally inside of us, there's like a dark and a light. There's a good wolf and a bad wolf, like kind of thing. And we want to, you can't just like crush one and then think that, oh, like everything can be fine and perfect. Or if they think that, they're going to get a very rude awakening very quickly. And there's this awareness like, oh, I need to manage my human impulses, my bestial impulses, my evil impulses, like whatever it is. So for ENTJ, it's more on the outside. It's like there is peace and there's conflict and they go together, and every system has those. This is why they're very comfortable with the sausage making of politics, or the fact that in a capitalist society, There are winners and losers. That there is evil, there is conflict, there is failure, there is badness. And at the same time, there are all these other good things that can happen as well. And peace and conflict happen together. This idea of like a utopian peace, that's something to be admired from a far distance, but it's not. It's they understand that's like that's not how anything works. That we wouldn't be human if there was just peace, and we wouldn't be human if there was just conflict. Um, I do think ENTJs have a soft spot. I mean, it's when they get to the point of crying about something, then that's like that little 3-year-old introverted feeling has come out, and the heart is crushed a little bit. And I have found a secret to working with ENTJs. If you want to get them to delve into that um, less pleasurable space, where they're going to reflect upon themselves and see some of their failures, because they can very easily just talk like a big game and sound very confident. And oh yeah, like how were those math problems? And I know from giving the math protocol with the EEG, oh yeah, no, those were really easy. And then I go through and grade them, and they said that so convincingly I wasn't going to even bother to score the math. And then I realized like, no, they got half of them wrong. So there was this like, I mean, the extroverted thinking is really good at faking it. Especially in the dominant form, and they sort of need to, but they trust, I can revise it as I go. Um, but there is this when you sort of like, if you want to turn their face to the dark side of things to address those, but to even admit them, here's the secret: get them when they're sick. They're staying home, they have the flu, they have COVID, like whatever it is, and that's the time. Is when that third function and seventh function and sensing is like really unhappy, and then they're going to go in, and you're going to find that self-reflective spot that can then lead into that soft spot, and that's a very nice. um it's a trick that works, and I wasn't expecting it to work. It just sort of happened. um And I would say the last thing is, just thinking about like different themes sort of organically. Like if I have to describe a rose bush or an oak tree, this is what we're doing here. Is what are the themes? Um, is one of the reasons they like to manage is because they actually do get frustrated in a lot of the detail. Like extroverted thinking and extroverted sensing can sort of fake some of the detail and walk through that. But especially when they have a lot of yang energy, they're very top down. And at a certain point, they're like, enough is enough. So some kind of job where they're always tweaking little elements, like that's not going to work for them. They could do that in service of something else, but there is this frustration that can come up. This just like, oh gosh, there's so little time to do things, and there's only so many resources, especially if they're resource poor in their situation. And they do reach a point where they get overwhelmed, whereas the ESTJ is going to be like, no, I got this. ESTJ can go through every single minutia element of the rules and regulations of the organization and stick with it and do all of the accounting and all of this number crunching. And I'm not saying that they like it, but they can do it. ENTJ is like, yeah, I got started, and then maybe I need medication to get through the rest. Because they do have actually this playful element that just wants to enjoy life, as well as being that sort of commander in charge, even if the commander in charge simply means of their own life, but wanting to enjoy that.
Yeah, you mentioned the element of the ENTJ having an easier time delegating resources or mobilizing people to get things done in comparison to their INTJ counterpart. And yeah, ENTJs, because of that extroverted thinking, can also be very good at metricizing, at having progress towards your goals, and at seeing the return on investment of what they're doing.
Mhm.
And yeah.
I really enjoyed years ago, and this literally was 15 to 20 years ago, working with another faculty member at UCLA and the business econ psychology convergence that was there. And I was doing computer programming for him. I was putting together the software that they were going to use for as part of a grant on people's behavior in situations of risk and uncertainty with money. And what I really appreciated is that the project, the goals, the milestones, the things I needed to do were all laid out. They were all very clear. He was a very good communicator. He was a little bit of a taskmaster. But if I got paid more, I'm not going to complain. And I really appreciated that it was always very clear, at least in my mind as a fellow NTJ, what he wanted and what needed to be done. And that made it what would be a complicated project a lot easier. I also learned in that a secret with all of the EJ types and ESTP, but I think ENTJ in particular, is if you're working with one and you're not happy with how things are going, they don't know that or they don't care until you step up and say something. Like if folks have ever seen like in a movie where the person is like, or TV show like, oh, I want a raise. And so somebody says to them, well, why don't you just go in and ask for the raise? The ENTJ is waiting for people, not like they're sitting around waiting, but they're not going to care unless you come in and actually ask for something. And I don't mean like, could this go please, something like that. Like, sell yourself. Like, say, this is why I deserve it. Like, put something on the table because they're expecting people to step up because they would step up. And I think that particularly for ENTJ, ESTJ, and ESTP, these and ENTP, even ET types, they are expecting other people to step up. And so that's just like that little piece of advice for anybody who's working with ENTJs.
Yeah, and that is a wonderful piece of advice. So, Dario, something you hinted at too was a lot of ENTJs have a confident and a definitive tone to their
Mhm.
voice. Whether or not they're actually confident about the thing, they seem
Yeah.
confident on the outside to the observer looking at them. That I guess that's why they get the stereotype of the commander. It like ENTJs don't resonate with that name, but they do look that way on the outside in the authority of their speech that they don't even know that they have at times.
Mhm.
It just
Mhm.
it seems like it's very direct. So
Yeah, yeah, and because as extroverts, they're often focusing more on wrangling and bringing the resources together and moving those over the back room, like research and learning part of something. And ENTJ's idea of becoming an expert and doing something really well is on the other end of the spectrum from INTP. INTP is going to spend years learning a subject in and out and is not going to open their mouth until they feel confident about something. ENTJ is going to open their mouth and talk about something with confidence that they looked on the internet for 5 minutes. Literally, I've seen, like, I've witnessed this, and I'm like, dude, you just like, how much research did you do? And he said, like, oh yeah, I just like Google for like 5 or 10 minutes. Now maybe that was really an hour or two, but the point was the ENTJ sometimes say like, oh, they feel like, oh, I'm a little bit of a fraud, like I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm like, yeah, because you just go too fast. Like, chill with it. Like, figure out what you're talking about. And that means doing research, and research is more than just the internet. Like, I don't know, where is your mental model that you're trying to build up? But I'm saying this is an INTJ, and so my focus is very different. Um, I think with the confidence, to be fair, it is also a brain thing, and everybody can do this. So the left prefrontal cortex can do something called confabulation, which is, and we're going to do an experiment right now. I'm going to ask you to lie, but please just go along with it. So could you give me a reason, Joyce, why you decided to wear a purple blouse today?
I decided to wear this today because I believe that purple is the color of attracting audience members to watch Type Talks. And so it is the lucky color of the year according to Chinese calendar. And so I'm I'm set up for success.
Okay, yeah. So all of you listening, so well, first of all, how did that feel?
It felt like improv, so then I have to come up with some explanation on the spot. But yeah, it felt s- it felt strange but doable, but I wouldn't be able to repeat that lie to you, so I I would forget about it. But um yeah, no. It's
Yeah,
like
because
yeah.
the more people use in a bias of use, the left prefrontal cortex, the better they can come up with reasons for things that actually have nothing to do with the actual reasons and could be lies. Now, for somebody in a leadership position, sometimes you just need to make a decision and to have that staying power to make decisions, knowing that some of those are going to be like spur of the moment, off the cuff. And if you talk to ENTJs, they're just like, oh, I look around for something in the environment to give me an idea of what to say. Or, the introverted intuiting, if it's not sensing, it's the introverted intuiting that sort of pops in like, oh, here's a little idea of something you could say. And they have the confidence that, like, well, first of all, a lot of the time it's can either be right or not matter. And if it is the wrong one, we can always fix that down the line. And so anybody can become very comfortable with just making up reasons. And we know this even from medicine when people suffer from this condition where they actually don't recognize their limbs as part of their own body, and you present them with their arm. So this is a real thing, by the way, weird, unusual, but it happens. And you ask, well, whose arm is this? And they can give like a very convincing explanation that it's the doctor's arm or their friend's arm who's right next to them, even though it's obviously not. And they believe it 100%. So the ability of the brain to manufacture reasons, to manufacture plans, to even as I'm speaking, you're speaking, to manufacture words out of nothing is like miraculous, but it's not always true. And
Mm.
I think that there are some types that can be drawn into that more than others. Realize like, oh yeah, I can just say things with confidence. Like at a young age, they realize this. Um, and then there are other people who sort of discover it along the way. And so I
Mhm.
would say for with any ENTJ, just because, and this is true of all of the TJ types, to be honest, that when they say something with a lot of confidence, it's okay to check and see like is that really the case? It's something to be aware of, that confidence, it has a power to it, but it also has the potential downside.
Well said, Dario. And so thank you for coming out. Check out Dario's products at Radiance House and check out his book, The 64 Subtypes. I'll have it linked below. And so I hope this video is helpful. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.
Thank you.